Righty, go you. Yeah.
All right, we are being live streamed.
Okay, I think I can start letting, we can start letting people in. So I'm going to do that. Hey y'all, thank you for joining us. We're just getting started here.
And as folks are joining, just so you know, like our other series, this one is being streamed live to Facebook. In case y'all want to be on, off camera, whatever your preference is.
Feel free to drop your names, pronoun, and location in the chat. And we'll get started in just a minute. Okay, we can go ahead and get started. Yeah, thank you all for being here. This is our 8th web session for the PWN Policy Fellowship and H&P Advocates Training. And this session is going to be on MIPA and Coalitions 101. Can we go to the next slide? Awesome, thank you. So this webinar is part of PWN's monthly policy and advocacy training series for 2023-2024. This curriculum was developed for PWN policy fellows and health malpractice advocates. Our curriculum is grounded in gender and racial justice and focuses on increasing knowledge of how our policy decisions are made, how we can impact them, and how to advocate for transformation to build the world we actually want to see, a world where all women, trans, and non-binary people living with HIV can live long, healthy, and dignified lives free from stigma and discrimination. And then can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So just some logistics and agreements. We are recording and live streaming to Facebook right now. So like Kelly said, feel free to turn your camera off, keep it on, whatever you prefer. And yeah, please share your name, pronouns, and location in the chat. We do have closed captioning on. Also, there are no dumb questions. We'll be monitoring the chat to bring up questions, and we've left space for questions at the end. This is a space to learn together. And yeah, we'll be monitoring and keeping track of the chat. We have 3 objectives for this webinar. So the first one is to learn about MIPA and how to demand MIPA in coalition spaces. Next, we want to learn about the characteristics of a strong coalition. And finally, we want to learn common challenges and hurdles in coalition work. And then just a quick note, some of y'all may have noticed already, we've been kicking AI and transcribing bots, and this is due to our confidentiality and security commitment. So basically it's just no information gathering with the consent, without the consent of all involved. And you can enable closed captioning, and we will also share the recording of this webinar. But if you need any further accessibility assistance, please reach out, and thank you in advance for understanding. So we have 2 amazing presenters with us today, and and I'm gonna let them introduce themselves. But this is Barb, who is the program director at Positive Women's Network, and Kamaria, who is the co-executive director at the SERO Project. Barb, do you want to do your introduction first?
Yes, I'm absolutely happy to introduce myself first. Hi, everybody. Barb Cardell. I use they, them pronouns. I come to this work as a white woman who has been living with HIV for 32 years. I've been involved in advocacy and engagement both at the local, state, and federal level. And I'm just so honored to be here as a part of this conversation today. And thank you.
And hi, everyone. Kamaria Laffrey, she, her pronouns. I am also a woman living with HIV. It's so good to see so many faces on here. I'm really happy to be able to present for you all today. Also, I'm based out of Florida and have been doing coalition work since 2016, I believe. So looking forward to our conversation today.
Great. Yeah.
Go ahead, take it away, Barb.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm so excited to start this conversation that I apologize. I just stomped on probably what you were gonna say after the introductions. Did you have anything you needed to add?
Nope, I don't. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to start off our conversation about MIPA, or the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV, by talking a little bit about why this is so crucial for us, especially as we're talking about coalitions and policy fellowship. It is so easy for us as people who are living with HIV to buy into self-stigmatizing thoughts and to judge and silence ourselves, when the reality is that we need to be more vocal, more engaged, and more involved in policies and programming and budgeting that impacts our lives, because it is only through our input that these programs, these policies meet our needs. So while we are often told that we are less than, that we should sit down, that we should be quiet, I actually want to encourage us all to be more engaged, to be louder, to push back, to demand that our needs are met. Because first off, we stand on a strong history. We stand on the shoulders of giants, of people who have led this movement, and I'll talk a little bit about it. But mostly, especially now as things have gotten more challenging, we need to make sure that we are demanding that we are engaged, because we are the closest to so many of the problems that are impacting our lives. And without our input, we are not able to let both our policymakers, but also our community and our service organizations that are supposed to be supporting us, letting us know where they're letting us down and how they need to do better. So we really are always engaged in the nothing about us without us. We must be involved in everything. Next slide. We come to this engagement from the Denver Principles, which celebrated its 40th anniversary this year. In 1983, a group of people living with HIV got together in Denver. I always am so proud to talk about the Denver Principles, because we were the middle ground. Advocates from San Francisco and New York came together and said, where can we launch this demand to be engaged, this statement about how our lives were going to be impacted and how we demanded to be included? Because if we think about it, 1983, the US government had not said the word AIDS yet. So many people were dying in silence. So many healthcare providers were making assumptions about what our lives needed. So this brave group of people came together, drafted up this statement, and shared it. And I'm just going to go ahead and read this because it gives me chills every single time I do. So in 1983, this group of people came together and they said, we condemn attempts to label us as victims. It is a term which implies defeat. And we are only occasionally patients, a term which implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with AIDS. We've now shaped that language to say we are people with HIV, and this is the foundation of our ongoing demands to be engaged and our requirements to be a part of every conversation. So this is our foundational document. Next slide. It comes to say that we need to be empowered to represent ourselves, that we must form caucuses that elevate our needs and demands rather than letting other people speak for us. We have seen time and time again that others who speak for us might think that they have our best intentions at heart, but ultimately we speak for ourselves and we know what we need. And by speaking up and standing up and being engaged, we fight back against stigma, we fight back against assumptions about who we are, how our lives are lived, and anything else that tells us that we are less than. We also must demand to be involved in every level of decision-making. Specifically, we need to serve on boards of directors and make sure that our voices and our votes count. And this in 1983 was really a critical piece. We must demand to speak for ourselves. The International AIDS Conference for many, many years had researchers and doctors who came and talked about people living with HIV. And finally, the stage was stormed and we had people who were living with HIV who were part of the convening. That was not at all something that was common, and we pushed back against it. Next slide. We come to this movement knowing full well that this did not emerge fully formed, but that the people living with HIV empowerment movement comes from so much of the strong history that we have had from these people-led organizations, from the civil rights movement, from the farm workers' rights movement, from union organizing, and from feminist movements. So we come to this knowing and learning lessons from them, but this is the first time that any particular illness came together and demanded to be treated with respect and required healthcare providers, our community, and our families to treat us in ways that we knew that we needed. We stood up, we pushed back, and we used these organizing movements as our foundations as we built what we needed. Since then, it actually has been used to inform a number of other rights and illness organizations and mobilizations, including the suicide prevention and postvention, as well as much of the harm reduction work that has gone around substance use disorder. Next slide. So really, when we're talking about it, we talk about MIPA and we talk about JIPA, and people are like, what on earth are these terms? Really pretty simply, MIPA is the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV. JIPA is the greater involvement living with people living with HIV. JIPA is used everywhere else other than the United States, and us, because we need to rename many things, we talk about MIPA as being the same thing, but it's based in the United States. So as we think about the work that has been done globally, MIPA, also known as JIPA, demands, so not just it requires, but demands that we be involved in programmatic policy, funding decisions, and actions that impact our lives, ensuring that we participate in the important decisions. And we'll talk about how this comes and has been recognized globally, almost sometimes globally more than it's been recognized in the United States. Next slide, please. So once again, it demands that we must be recognized as having important contributions and that we are creating spaces where we have our meaningful involvement and our opportunity to provide input, that we are listened to in the ways that we demand. So I just listed here a little bit. Next slide, please. And we'll go ahead and put these resources in the chat as well. So MIPA and global policy. When we demand to be included in policy conversations, we have an incredible amount of history that stands behind it. So we have the Denver Principles from 1983. We have a Paris Declaration that demands that people living with HIV be a part of any policy that impacts their lives. This Paris Declaration was signed by 42 countries, including the United States. I'm just going to say that again. This declaration demanding that people living with HIV included in meaningful discussions about policies that impact their lives was signed by 42 countries, including the United States. And we do not, unfortunately, see that today. 1999, there was a UN AIDS declaration. 2006, PEPFAR came out, which was funding for the emergency relief. And that requires that these countries that accept that funding, and of course, not the United States, because we're doing this for everywhere else, we require that they include people living with HIV in advisory bodies to meaningfully inform policies. Only in 2006, or actually, sorry, it was 2015 with the National HIV/AIDS Strategy, did we finally actually identify the need and the demand to have people living with HIV in the United States involved. So when we talk about this and we talk about demanding to be included at these tables, and we push back at AIDS Watch and we say to our representatives, you need to listen to us because we know what we're doing. We stand on a firm history globally where this has been included in so many of these documentations. Again, I'll put all of these in the chat once I'm done presenting, because I want you all to go and look at least one of them. I am so proud of the work that global advocates have done to include the voice and the demand for inclusion of people living with HIV. Next slide. Okay, we talk about MIPA and there's challenges, and we know that they are. Oftentimes the people who were asked to lead were not people who represented populations that needed to actually have solutions enacted. So we have the white cis gay male dominance in power and invisibility. In the early days, many people got sick and many people died. We talk about the professionalization pressures, which are absolutely that you need to have the letters behind your name. You know what, people, I'm going to tell you right now, the only letters you need to have behind your name are SME, subject matter expert. And that is what every single one of us is showing up and delivering and living with. And again, as we talk about the demographics of the epidemic shifting, it oftentimes marginalizes people who most need to be engaged. Next slide. Why does MIPA matter? Boy, I bet every single person on here can give an example about why MIPAs matter. MIPA, meaningful involvement of people living with HIV, matters. We know we can talk about services that have been developed that don't meet our needs. We can talk about clinic hours that actually aren't useful for people who have jobs during the day. When a clinic closes at 5 o'clock in the evening, that is not meaningfully involving people living with HIV because it's not accessible. We talk about stigma and discrimination. We talk about increasing the effectiveness of the policies and ensuring that funded programs meet our needs. I know I just actually this morning looked at a policy that was talking about housing, and it required that people actually have HAPWA on their application, which when we talk about stigma, we know for a fact that no one living with HIV was probably a part of that planning process, because we know that HIV-related stigma is real and very present in today's world. So when we think about people who are not willing to be involved in the HAPWA program because they don't want to have their status shared, we know that somebody living with HIV was not included in the planning of that program. And so when we talk about MIPA, we talk about why it's so important. It's because it's about our lives, our safety, and our needs. Next slide. All right, so what does MIPA look like in practice? We've already talked a little bit about it. It's about meaningfully centering our voices. It is about recognizing that most impacted people are those subject matter experts. We need to think about compensating, mentoring, and elevating the voices of people who need to be in the room. Oftentimes, people will come and say, oh, Barb, we want to have a person living with HIV be on a planning council, be on an advisory body. And I look around and I think, well, not only do you need to have a person living with HIV, you need to have the right people living with HIV. You need to elevate the voices of Black women. You need to elevate the voices of trans people living with HIV. You need to elevate the voices of Latinx folks, Indigenous folks, communities of color. You need to make sure that we are moving beyond just a person living with HIV to a representative person. You need to have youth. You need to have dandelions, our lifetime survivors. That is the part that when we talk about meaningfully involving people, we're not just having a person, but we're having the right person who represents the populations that most need to be heard. that we are moving beyond tokenizing. And here's the biggest challenge that I'm going to absolutely say is that when we're talking about hiring staff at organizations, we need to demand, if we're on the hiring body, we need to demand that people living with HIV are given account, that are included in the process, that lived experience is seen as just as valuable as education, and that we think about people living with HIV having so much to offer in ways that are not often accounted for in traditional hiring processes. So we must demand that our people are not just the people who are doing street outreach, who are doing testing, but then when we think about leadership and the wisdom that that is also taken into account and included. Next slide. And again, what's not MIPA? I'm telling you right now, every person who is on this webinar has seen an example of what is not meaningfully including us. It is absolutely, being present, but you don't have a vote. Being invited to join for the dinner, but actually not being a part of the agenda setting. That we volunteer our time, that we get a gift card, not actual compensation for being the subject matter experts that we are. And then oftentimes being asked to be the voice or the face of a campaign when we actually haven't had any part in developing that campaign, making sure that it addresses our needs, uses language that we embrace, and that is really identifying what we see to be the challenges. So I am just about, next slide, I'm just coming to the end of my presentation, talking about why meaningfully involving people living with HIV is so critical. Hopefully you all feel a little enthusiastic and inspired to be a part of this, because here's the piece I want to leave with you, is that we have to be present in every part of a decision that impacts our lives, because otherwise the money will be spent in ways that do not meet our needs. We need to continue to mobilize on the streets and showing that housing, as we have this housing work example from the street protest in 2012, housing is critical for everyone who is living with HIV. Next slide, please. That decision makers must listen to us as we are talking about what our needs are, and that we continue, as we have this HINAC example here, that we have conferences that are developed by and for us, that are led by and for us, that have a significant percentage of presenters that are by and for people who are living with HIV. So again, demand meaningful involvement of people living with HIV. We are not the problem. I'm going to say that again. When we speak up, and I'm looking at some of you right now, we are not the problem. We are the solution. And we must be everywhere. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and sorry, I got a little preachy at the end, because I know sometimes people are like, oh, they don't want me to come and talk at this planning council meeting. They don't want me to talk at the table. But I'm telling you right now, our history is strong and deep that this is exactly what we must do. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it back to Maya. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Barb, for that amazing presentation. So I think we have time to do questions for Barb section of the presentation now. So feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat, and we can take any.
Hi, Barb. This is Yolanda from Houston, Texas. Thank you for an amazing presentation. And you're absolutely correct. I saw you at the conference we had in Washington, D.C. this past September. And there were a lot of individuals there that were not, don't get me wrong, that their conference was amazing. But there were a lot of people saying that there was not enough of us, our voices being heard in regards to they had the people, the leaders and stuff. And you're absolutely correct that we should step up to the mantle to become leaders and getting our voices out there and changes that we want to see on the micro, meso, and macro levels regarding HIV/AIDS. So when you empowered me to say, do something, you be the voice, you speak your truth, it resonated with me. So that's what I wanted to say, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yolanda. I couldn't have said it better. I mean, when we go to these conferences and people are brought there by their organizations or as a part of a grant or something like that, and they are not people living with HIV and they're taking up so much space, so much space. I mean, you all know, okay, if you don't know me, I'm just going to share that I spend most of my time sort of like walking along, muttering that people need to just sit the hell down and listen to us. Because they say things like, well, I just don't know where to find youth living with HIV and to have them be on my advisory council. And I just think, talk to people living with HIV. We know where people are. We know how to get people here. We know how to meet these needs. We know what is going on. We know what is working and what's not working. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I usually mutter a lot to myself at the conferences, and occasionally I just can't take it any longer. And I usually stand up and I'm like, well, as someone who's living with HIV, I'm going to tell you that you need to just sit down and listen. Usually they don't, but they should, because we know. Absolutely. And I think Tashira, you had a question or a comment, and then you put your hand down, but I'm going to see if you wanted to add anything.
Well, I want to say first, good evening to everyone. And Barb, I really was moved by your presentation. It was difficult to, fight back tears because although I'm an ally of persons living with HIV, I was touched by it my whole entire life. My mother died just 2 days after being released from prison. My whole family on my maternal side was pretty much wiped out because of HIV in the late 80s and early 90s due to IV drug use and risque behavior that goes back to their trauma. So when we talk about being inclusive of people who are living with HIV, I think it's very important that we raise our voices as a community and amplify the fact that intersectionality is real for BIPOC and Latinx populations, especially those who are also of the LGBTQIA plus communities. They deserve intentional representation of the community. And when the community speaks, the community is heard. When the community is heard, then all people are represented and working in advocacy through, Black maternal health initiatives. I see where the women and the birthing people who are living with HIV, who want to exercise their reproductive rights to give birth or to not give birth or to raise children, they are not included in the conversation. When you look at intersectionality and how Child Protective Services gets involved, that is another area. We're not really looking at the full scope in terms of how communities that are already facing challenges and disparities are, hit again when you're living with HIV, and now you've got an open CPS case because someone is questioning your ability to be able to take care of your child when it all goes back to a life-threatening illness. That's not equity, that's not equality, and it's wrong. And I'm just glad to be centered among people who don't look at this as just social justice work. They look at it as, this is a part of me, and my life has been forever changed by HIV. And I just wish my 36-year-old mother could have had the opportunity to be supported and represented and to be advocated for. And, I look at my brother who is HIV positive, who's of the LGBTQIA community, and I look at how he lives in fear every day because perhaps if someone finds out, or his career. And I feel like, those are areas that we can really, work hard on. And I'm just glad to be a part of a community of other advocates that take up the mission. And Barb, thank you so much for the jewels that you dropped and the information you shared. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that is powerful statement, and I absolutely agree. And I'm just going to say, because I do know we do have a couple of allies on the call. Allies, we got a space for you and a need for you as well. Absolutely. That'll be my next presentation, hopefully, that I'll get to give on allyship for people or with people living with HIV. But when we think about intersectionality and we think about stigma and we think about meaningful involvement, I'm going to say one thing, which is that we are a winning movement when we are able to include people who are not able to disclose for a variety of reasons. We need to be able to think of leadership opportunities for people to engage without disclosing their status, because HIV always has been a cause and a consequence of violence. So we need to also be really mindful of that. And I always try and add that disclosure piece in, because disclosure is complicated and people come to it in a variety of different ways. And being able to engage with everyone who wants to be a part of the movement is critical. And I think that is, I'm checking to see, I don't think there's any other questions. So Maya, I'll turn it back over to you, and we can go ahead and go to Kamaria a little bit early.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barb. And those are some awesome questions and some awesome sharing. So appreciate y'all for pitching in. Kamaria, you can go ahead and jump in with your presentation on coalitions.
Yeah, so thank you, Barb, for grounding us in MIPA. Thank you for the comments and the sharing. And I'm also sitting here, just sitting with some emotions, some big feelings as I think about how I come into this specific work around coalitions. So I now serve as the co-ED at the SERO Project, which works to center people living with HIV in ending the criminalization of someone's HIV status throughout the country, and also with our global partners. And to Shira, I believe, I hope I'm saying your name right. You named like all the things. You named all the things of why coalitions are needed and how to approach them. So we can just jump right into it. Next slide. So coalitions are about building and sharing power, not having someone that has, as Barb named, letters behind their name and agrees, and then they come in and say, I want to start a coalition, and then they put out a paper, and then there's a coalition. It's really about building relationships. It's about understanding where the coalition is going to be centered and what is the priority issue that the coalition wants to, or multiple issues that the coalition wants to address, and how to share that power out so that it's not just held within the coalition, but also impacting the community that the coalition is supposed to be serving. Next slide. So in looking at that, you have to understand the dynamics between power and oppression. So power is working through fear and sorry, my slide. I'm on my phone, so I have to zoom on the Zoom. Power over working through fear and coercion. Those with power tend to create patterns of punishment and rewards, which limit people's access to a full range of choices and options, which Barb named in our like care council and our advisory boards. There's often one of the power dynamics I've experienced personally is economic justice, where someone comes in and says, we need your emotional labor. Here is a voucher for a pizza, or here is a $10 gift card or an Uber voucher. And while those things add to and supplement things in my life, there is no dollar amount you can put on my emotional labor of me having to show up in my lived experience as a woman living with HIV and constantly having to correct and help shift and shape a program when you should have been consulting me and others like me from day one instead of as an afterthought. And this can also feel, and often is, oppressive. I was on a webinar just the other day talking about MIPA and how folks feel silenced, as Barb has said. We can feel in our bodies when we are experiencing stigma. We witness oppression and know it's happening, and sometimes are afraid to name it because we're afraid of the retaliation that does happen. People's voices get silenced, they get asked to leave different advisory boards and focus groups, and that is very systematic, which means the system is over and undervaluing certain people. It's also pervasive because it is literally everywhere, and we have to be loud about it, and we have to be comfortable about calling it out. And it's also institutional, which means these are institutions that are in place that are benefiting from the systematic oppression that reinforce the isms. And it's also super frustrating because I know I've been around Barb at conferences and heard the mumbling and have shared in the mumbling of folks just need to sit down and listen to us. But also when folks are giving us that space of their best intentions of making us feel heard, it's also our duty to hold them accountable to that. And for me, that is being comfortable with being uncomfortable, if that makes sense. So being willing to let my anger show, being willing to call people in as well as call people out publicly and to the side, and having conversations. Sometimes I frame it in ways that make it seem like I don't know what's happening. So I'm always asking questions. Anybody who knows me, I will be at a meeting and I'll ask a question. Sometimes I know the answer to it. I want to know, do you know the answer? Do you know why this system is operating the way it is? And then I go from there. Next slide. So power within is working through the connection with self, connection with others, and the greater meaning of your coalition issue or whatever the greater issue is that you're fighting for. Those with personal and collective power are able to honor their beliefs, their communities, and their dignity, often risking their safety in order to maintain self-determination. And this is for me, it's a journey. It's not something that happens overnight. And this is why community and coalitions are so important, because you have others that have been doing this in different intersectional spaces that can offer guidance and support and hold space for you as you figure out how to navigate this. And as it says, social change starts here. It starts with you understanding, embracing, and trusting the power within yourself. Next slide. So these are just some coalition essentials, just 4 of them. And I'll probably spend some time here just kind of digging through how I've applied this in my own work. So 1 is know your role and know your goals. 2 is examine who built your table and who was sitting at it. And I will add to that who needs to leave. 3, build relationships, share power and knowledge. 4, shape, name, and reshape expectations. So for me, in my experience, the first and foremost thing that has to happen in coalition building, or for me specifically, I started building a coalition in Florida for the Florida HIV Justice Coalition, which works to change our criminalization laws in the state of Florida. Essentially, there was a strategic planning meeting, folks that were available to come to this meeting, and a wide statewide invite went out. Folks who were available to come came to the Capitol. We sat and we talked about what our awareness was of HIV criminalization, how it was showing up in the state. And we did an analysis, a SWOT analysis. So understanding our strengths, our weaknesses, our opportunities, and our threats, and naming those things, and then identifying people in the room that could either address, do research, or help invite others who weren't currently at that table that day. And so in that time, knowing my role was just, I was a participant and helping build the strategy around how the coalition was going to start in the first place, with the understanding that the coalition was to grow and more people were to be added. So examining who built your table and who is sitting at it, to me, is really, really critical. And it ties also into number 4 of shaping, naming, and reshaping expectations. Because sometimes, for example, we started I said it's 2015 that we started, and there were players at the table at the time then that served a season and weren't necessarily needed for the long term of the coalition, and they transitioned out. In some coalitions, there may be folks that start from day 1 and they never go. And maybe their role needs to be reassessed. And you should not ever, ever, ever be afraid of doing that. if you're noticing that energy in your coalition is stagnant, if the political landscape has changed in your state and is impacting how people are able to show up. For folks that were able to maintain and continue to build coalitions when we had the onset of COVID-19, hats off to you, salute you for that, because I know that was a lot of labor to navigate, to maintain something that was built before the whole world had to stop. And then still continuing beyond that and doing a reassessment of, okay, now we have HIV and this other, and how do we pay attention and stay attuned to this other that doesn't take away from our work, but we can be mindful of in navigating our work. Also, a key part is building the relationships. It's important to trust your other coalition members, to be able to bring in folks that have voice and expertise. So your public health officials, for example, are critical to our coalition in Florida. We have to have medical providers at the table. We do all of this with the centering of people living with HIV, but also in that MIPA strategy, and I might be jumping ahead of my slides because I'm reading from my notes, but in that MIPA strategy, you also want to, as Barb has named, make sure you're using an intersectional lens. Make sure that if you're sitting at a table and there's 5 of you sitting there and all of you are living with HIV, but all of you are Black women, Black cisgendered women, and there's no trans women at the table, there's no drug users at the table, there's no sex workers at the table, but you're talking about laws that impact those communities, then you are not being intersectional, you are not being inclusive, and you need to reassess. And you need to take the time to pause. There's a mentor of mine shared with me once that this issue is too important to rush. It's too urgent to rush. And you have to be willing to take your time to make those assessments and trust others at the table as well as you build. Next slide. So you also want to establish your goals. For example, the Florida HIV Justice Coalition, our straightforward goal is to end the HIV laws in Florida. And so our strategy is to modernize. We know politically that we are up against a lot of systemic violence in our state, and doing a full repeal is not a viable option at this time. So we're going towards modernizing. So that's our goal. So we asked ourselves, what are we trying to build and what is in our way? And there's a lot in our way, mostly our governor, as he has strategically silenced a lot of entities that had been helpful to us in the past. And then also we constantly assess whether our goal is long-term or outcome-oriented. And we are currently in the middle of a refresh now of trying to understand, like, let's say we change the laws tomorrow, does the coalition disband or do we take on another issue? And currently we're looking at what those other issues would be that folks are wanting to prioritize in Florida. And also knowing your role, getting very clear and very organized. So it's helpful to have set up a potential chair or a chair and a co-chair of your coalition, having frequent and consistent meetings so folks who are being invited into that space know when you're coming together, and having potentially things in writing such as bylaws. I believe in documenting everything. And it's important to create this kind of structure so that you're not the lone ranger doing it all by yourself. Like, we believe that everyone is capable to change the world, but we're not on an island of one. And it is important that you are bringing in other voices and getting support for yourself. Because I know for me, if I'm looking at a document alone for days and days and days, I'm going to miss something because I've been staring at it too long. And so I'll pass it to someone else. Like, I need a fresh set of eyes on this. And that's the same with your coalition structure and organization. And also adding value, do not duplicate a service to a cause. Next slide. So back to, I think it was point number 2 or 3, examining who built the table and who was sitting at it. Remember the influence of oppression on our lives and our movements, and think about that history that Barb shared with us. Whose stories have we organized on top of? So whose shoulders are you standing on, or whose necks are you standing on? If your coalition strategy is leaving someone out, then I feel like you're standing on someone's neck instead of standing on their shoulder. How can we honor the work it took to get to this point and add the new skills and stories necessary to move forward? And I truly believe training sessions such as this PWN webinar series, as well as other partner organizations with SERO, help create those skills development. Going to conferences such as HIV is Not a Crime Training Academy. While we do talk about criminalization, we do talk about the intersectional nuances of other issues around public health, and how HIV historically has been what it's been, and how we have, if we want to get to an end to this, we have to be very strategic and intentional and honest with ourselves about how we end that. Next slide. Continuing, what identities do we need to center? So Florida learned the hard way, because I honestly came into the coalition work not having a full understanding of intersectionality. I'm very transparent about where my deficits are, of what I do and don't know, and that learning is a lifetime journey. And so one regret that I have is that we did not have sex workers and the trans community and people who use drugs at the table at the onset of the coalition development, and wanting to make sure as we move forward that we are more inclusive and intentional in bringing those voices in. And also not just bringing those voices in, but my approach has been reaching out to them and asking, how can I support you? Not come to my table and hear what we're mad about, but I want to come and see how is this impacting your community? What can I do to be an ally, to be a better support to your issue? And then we start building a relationship, and then we start having conversations around how our issues intersect. Also, what skills do we need to achieve our goals? One important skill I've learned the hard way is how to schedule a meeting. Sometimes we get in these conference spaces and you don't have time to sit and talk with people, and you get their contact information. How do you truly follow up in a meaningful way, and use tools to help build a relationship and make it accessible for that individual or that body of people to come and meet with you? And how do you assure that both groups have equal influence, access to information, and skill building? And one way is this webinar training. Another way is reaching out to your mentors, reaching out to folks that you see leading meetings, and asking them, how did you do that? That's how I've learned. It's just, hey, I noticed you did an event and you mobilized 20 people to start passing out petitions to get this issue added to the agenda. How did you do that? Will you sit and walk me through it? I shadowed a lot of people in the beginning of my advocacy, literally just sitting in the room in the back and just watching how it worked, and then applying what made sense to me and how I wanted to approach things. Next slide. Oh, okay. So I do want to add a couple, well, I just want to reiterate one thing. I work with a lot of folks that are either starting a coalition or they have been holding a coalition space for a really, really long time. And I think Barb can attest to this as well. The one thing I want to encourage the folks that have been holding it for a really long time is, please don't be afraid to start over. Please don't be afraid to say, you know what, we've been doing XYZ for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, and now it's feeling like a hamster wheel. It feels like our progress is just circling over and over. We're doing the same thing and expecting different results, and it's time to try something new. There's going to be folks that are going to have some resistance. They're not going to understand, because we get caught up in our autopilot mode. And some folks have a hard time letting go of that. And you have to not be afraid to kind of help guide people and shift them into a different direction. And if you ever need support in that, you have PWN, you have myself at SERO, and so many other powerful advocates, including folks at the caucus, US People Living with HIV caucus, that have been doing this coalition work and helping folks really push the needle forward to implement change, whether that's changing HIV laws or adding more MIPA value into advisory boards so that voices are heard and not tokenized or exploited. So I will stop there because I really don't know how long I've been talking, and I'll take any questions.
Yes, we have plenty of time for questions. So feel free to send questions for Kamaria and Barb. And I know Barb has one question, but we'll let any folks who want to ask Kamaria something hop in first and then maybe go to Barb's question. So yeah.
I don't have a question. However, I do have a comment about coalition building. And I think it's more of a I think it's more of a concern. Like in addressing coalition building, I feel like it's important to have dialogue around how there are organizations and entities who do create space for those of us who have been traditionally marginalized and have felt excluded from these conversations that create the opportunities for us to have greater access and resources. But a lot of times, it's the bare minimum. And when I say the bare minimum, I mean not enough for you to go back and sow into your community and for you to be able to create spaces of healing and for you to organize. It's enough for you to maybe do something small, like maybe catch up on, pay your cell phone bill or something like that. But like for visionaries like myself, wait, hold on one second. Yeah, so like when we have visionaries in our communities, like myself, because I heard the presenter saying a lot about bringing like not having trans people who had done drugs at the table for the presentation, and like that percentage is very small, and so finding visionaries and leaders who are going to step up and be willing to do the work, that pool is going to even be smaller. And so when you have a group that has very specific needs like that, and they're not receiving the support that they need to be of a resource to their constituents or the community that they're serving, then it creates an imbalance that looks really different than it does in other communities who tend to have more support and more access because it's more of them to, maneuver and get resources. So when we're creating these opportunities for community, like we truly need to be doing the work of examining these people that we're bringing on and making sure bringing on for these coalitions and making sure that they are invested in actually empowering these communities. For example, when I was in New Orleans this past weekend, I was asked to speak at a function for people who were living with HIV, and they were celebrating living with HIV. And I was given the opportunity to speak for 10 minutes, and I was given $1,250 to speak at that event. That money allowed me to then in turn pay other people to be in a function that I was having, where I in turn talked about you equals you. So I was able to pour into the community because someone poured into me. And so when we're creating these opportunities, we want to create opportunities that not only create opportunities for the person who is benefiting directly from those resources, but also so that that person can pay it forward and also sow into their community. And then that is how we build solid coalitions, in my opinion.
Thank you so much for that. That's how we build solidarity, and that's how we build power. And you named a lot of important perspectives to have when making those approaches. And you said it, I wrote it down right when you said it, but pay it forward, that pay it forward approach when folks are on the end of receiving the benefit, that they are a liaison to those other voices that need to be uplifted as well. So thank you so much for sharing that.
And thank you. Like, I was writing down when you were talking too.
Kamaria, before you go on, I know that a couple of hands are raised, but there was a question that was dropped in the chat a little bit earlier that I think goes nicely off of Kaneen's question. So can you discuss the conversation you've had in asking someone to leave the table and why that conversation is important?
Ooh, y'all are streaming. Okay. Yeah. So, okay. So sometimes you can have partners in your coalition that may not agree with the pace of the majority of the decisions that are being made. So our coalition has a steering committee, and the steering committee was moving in one direction. And we were about to go into what you call committee hearings for one of our sessions. And there was a key person we needed to give testimony during those sessions. And a coalition member misrepresented themselves to this individual, and kind of gave them, in hindsight, gave them a red flag that we weren't being as inclusive to certain populations, and that they were just giving them a heads up. That heads up ended up turning into that person not giving the testimony that we needed. So at the time, the steering committee wanted that person who misrepresented themselves as a coalition member, they were more of an outside partner, to no longer be a part of the coalition calls, because, well, they also were asked to remedy that by reaching out to that individual and explaining why we had the strategy we did for that particular committee hearing. They chose not to do that. So there was a misunderstanding in that way, but the whole conversation was basically, we as a coalition move with a voice that's grounded in science and grounded in MIPA. And because that communication with that individual was done outside of communicating with the entire coalition, they were asked to leave. Harms have been repaired since then, and they actually are welcomed back into the coalition, which is also something that takes a lot of hard conversations. It takes putting aside ego. It takes putting aside or reprioritizing what our why is, and shifting power dynamics. So I'm grateful to say that now that time has passed, and we don't know whether that particular testimony would have actually helped us at all. We're now having our fresh start with this body of, can y'all still hear me? Okay, with that body of individuals, that individual that was asked to leave. So they're now still a part of the coalition. So it's like a cycle. You just like, hey, you're in timeout because you created a harm for our work, but also that harm wasn't done I don't feel it was done in a malicious way. They were just letting that entity know that we hadn't had conversations with people that we needed to. So I hope that answered the question that person asked. Okay. And I do see Lauren and Tashira's hand.
Well, I'm sorry, can I go, or was the other person going? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. In relation to what you shared about coalition building, I just had a question in terms of when you were the point 4 was shaping, naming, and then reshaping expectations. So when you have people all coming together who have a shared interest, everybody shares commonality with the cause. What do you do within one coalition when everybody has a different element to attack? Because it's like you have to have goals, and I saw how you put, what are you trying to build? Okay, know who's at the table, who built the table, but how do you gauge it when there are so many people with so many valid areas that advocacy is needed? Because we don't live single issue lives. It's a many issues. And oftentimes where you find one, you find something else hiding behind it that you wasn't even ever thinking existed. And that's where intersectionality, you know, really gets an expansion, because we really see how if you're Black, if you're trans, if you have HIV, if you are at the lower end of the socioeconomic status, those are 4 elements of being railroaded, that at any given time, when you get out of one thing, you're faced with another thing that's against you. So it's kind of like bringing all of these types of people who share these devastating truths of what they encounter in society. How do you center it, and where do you put the focus on? Because everything is important. And I find a lot of times with coalitions, there's so much information to be shared. There's so many value spaces of resources. It's so many, you know, people with appellations and lived experience and education. Where do you really put the order of importance? Because it's all relevant. You know, we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about, you know, overcoming the disenfranchisement of a whole system that was never meant to protect us, you know, especially when you wake up in the morning Black. You can't escape that. You know, you can somehow pick and choose what you'll share about your health status or your sexuality, but when you have the first presentation of yourself and people, and you're trying to go towards social justice, I just found it so exhausting when you've got to now decide what's relevant, what deserves more attention. Well, where do you go with this? And then where do we get the help for this? And then after you get past that, here's something else in your face. And then the coalition becomes exhausting. And I feel that that's been my experience with, you know, keeping them active, because it's exhausting. And then the mental component, you know, is there an outlet for us? Is there some type of emotional support? Because that's another element of advocacy and coalition building. And, you know, we're addressing policy, but it's hard to do that and not be political. And when you see just how much, you know, systemic oppression is real, you know, the health inequities are real. We're real people, regardless of what your health status is or your sexual orientation. Why are we treated anything less than human? I know I've said a lot, and it's my excitement talking, but it's also the challenges of my lived experience in this space and not seeing coalitions thrive and be successful and really hit the mark like they should, simply because someone felt, well, this issue isn't getting enough attention, when in fact, maybe it isn't. But how do you know how much deserves what when everything and everybody is relevant?
Yeah. So this is a common struggle. This is, I feel, part of the reason why we are 40 plus years in this epidemic, because there are so many, and at so many things. And at the end of the day, like you named, it's really a system that we're trying to dismantle and rebuild from that, because the systems that are in place are working how they were designed to. They are working exactly how they were designed to work, which is to keep people marginalized, which is to keep people disenfranchised. But to answer your question from my perspective, one thing in coalition building that you have to, I don't want to say you have to, but one thing that should be considered is being very, very clear about your objectives, because there are so many things. And I recommend maybe picking 2 to 3 and sticking to that. And should you get more, then you can create a subgroup. If there is that one person or 2 people that's like, hey, y'all aren't talking about housing enough. And we have to be real and name, like, a lot of our coalitions follow the trends of whatever the funding is that's available, or whatever is the hot topic, from larger entities making these higher decisions without us. I really encourage folks, if you have not already, to read Demanding Better by the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, because it names all of these issues, and you can always flip and reprioritize. Just like they flip and reprioritize how they allocate funds to our community, we can reprioritize which thing we want to make noise about. But one thing, Kelly, that's your nighttime reading once a week. I think it's really important to at least stick to 2 or 3 that the whole body is aware, like, this is what we're focusing on, but we also know this other thing is going to emerge. And when it does, we have this subgroup or this work group that's going to take it on and develop a strategy. And that strategy might be in conjunction with the larger coalition, or it might be an additional piece. So for example, the HIV Justice Coalition may be focusing on, we're going to have a lobby day and we're mobilizing 200 people to get to the Capitol. Meanwhile, it's during an election year. And you're like, well, dang, I also want to get people registered to vote. And I also want to make sure that they're getting to their voting precinct and that they know what their rules are in their district. And so those 200 people you're mobilizing to get to the Capitol, you can also build a campaign around voter registration and double checking their status of where they are in their votes in their district. So there's ways to coalesce things. And there's also timing and just prioritizing. I don't believe in telling people no just because there's not funding. We have done amazing things without dollars. We have gotten the attention and made our voices heard without a dollar sign attached to it. But money does help because you want to compensate folks and you want to be able to build resources and campaigns and be able to have something built. But that's just one approach that I would take, is when you have your objectives, but then something else emerges, to keep it from feeling like it's not important, ask those people who feel passionate about it, hey, do you want to take lead on this and maybe have a subcommittee, and how can we support you in that? And that, I would say, go from there. And that's a part of that reassessing that we've been talking about, is you look at what your objectives are and you're like, well, does this fit in any of the objectives that the coalition currently has? You named something else that I wanted to speak to, and I didn't write it down, so I lost it. Hopefully it'll come back to me, but I hope that helped.
What's it about CPS?
No, I didn't write it down, so I don't. If I don't write it down, it didn't happen. So. It'll come back to me hopefully during this call, and I'll turn off my camera and drop it in the chat.
Okay, but I thank you for highlighting how the coalitions go after the funding, because if you really look at where the pools of funding is, abolish the family policing system. Absolutely, I'm all for that, because we just don't know what the real demographics are and how persons living with HIV are horribly disenfranchised. They remove their children from them. I work in child welfare. I see what's done. And when we find out that this mom is living with HIV, we find out because we have access to their medical records that are not protected, and they go after these parents, and these children are not safe in foster care, especially when they're living with HIV. So now you have a mom or a parent that's struggling with their own health, and the system decides you're not worthy of this and of being a parent. They take their kids away. And I just feel like we gotta do something for these families, because maternal mental health, in conjunction with the life-threatening illness, in conjunction with all of the other intersectional challenges, it's just not fair what's happening, and all people are doing is money chasing.
Ooh, you said a word there, the money chasing, and then leaving us locked in a hamster wheel, but then sprinkling down some little nuggets for us to fight each other for, and keep us from working together, and keep us from building larger coalitions and having and building more power within our communities. And I forgot that you did mention CPS, and that to me is another form of criminalization when you're thinking about people who can give birth, around the threat of criminalization, even on how they choose to feed their child. And so that's like a whole nother level. So like you're naming things that came up in our coalition. Like we had our objectives, and then we started learning more about harm reduction around breast and chest feeding. And we started learning more about molecular HIV surveillance and how all these things impact people and tie into criminalization. And again, going back to reassessing what is your objective and what is your priority, and also making that reassessment based on the things that change that are external, that are outside of your control. So, for example, in Florida, we got a governor that I don't like. And so we have to reassess how we approach the work that we take on and even how we talk about it publicly. Like we were geared and ready for a large media campaign to start publicly talking about HIV criminalization in an educational format. And then when we got the governor we were like, nope, can't do it. It is too dangerous. We are not putting people's lives under a bigger microscope for this crazy man. So yes, to all the things that you said, and you really could have done this webinar for us, honestly, to share. Don't look surprised. You are a subject matter expert as well. But I do want to capture, I think it was Lauren that do you still want to speak? No?
I can ask a question really briefly. It was a much shorter question. So thank you for the seminar. I found out about the seminar from the New Moon Network. So I am involved in sex worker organizing, and I really appreciated you naming sex workers as people who, you know, should be at the table in these coalitions. And you know, I was thinking about what you said, you know, about how hard it is to involve people with marginalized identities to help sort of like improve the sort of inclusivity of organizations, like after these coalitions have already been established. That's something that I've also really seen a lot of in sex worker organizing. And I would just ask to you, like, how is it that sex workers can be better at building coalitions with people living with HIV, especially given that there's so much stigma and people don't necessarily want to disclose? Like, what is it that we can do to be better, you know, be in coalition better?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And it's almost like I'm kind of sitting with going back to its relationship building, and maybe like there needs to be, I feel, a more unified front of HIV community and sex work community. I know there have been many attempts for having conversations around educating, especially within coalitions, not conflating human trafficking with sex work, but also being aware that there is an intersection there, but they are not the same thing. And I have heard in the beginnings of HIV coalitions being built around criminalization specifically, decriminalization specifically, not quite having a good pulse on that. And so one thing I will say, I don't have full knowledge. So it has to be a strong relationship and a united front of where maybe there needs to be an HIV and sex work organization or a coalition. I know I sit on a federal coalition of folks that have conversations, but I haven't seen anything consistently statewide level that I mean, I would love to see that. I know SERO has been working on creating a webinar series and bringing in experts that are in the sex work community to have those conversations of how do you avoid conflating these issues and what are the specific sex work policies that need attention and need amplification from the HIV community, because that's not happening either. So I don't know if that's really an answer to your question. There's just things that float around in my head of how we can build better coalition. I don't even know if it's better coalition, but just being more intentional about how we show up and stand in solidarity with one another. And so I'm not quite sure what that takes, but I'm willing to like look at developing a roundtable of folks that give a damn and coming together and having these conversations around what are you seeing in your region and states? What are you seeing from public health? What are you seeing from federal partners that are addressing this? Because they're not. And we name that in our Demanding Better document that sex workers, immigrants, marginalized people basically aren't being addressed in the National HIV/AIDS strategy, which is ridiculous. So again, Lauren, I don't think I really answered your question. I'm just very excited that you brought it up and raised it, and would love to talk with you offline on what that looks like, and whoever else is on that would love to be a part of that conversation to build something meaningful and intentional with objectives that can help support those that are in coalitions in their states to be more intentional.
And if I can just go ahead and jump in to talk about coalition work, because we had a coalition in Colorado called the Mod Squad that was specifically convened to work on addressing the 3 laws that targeted people living with HIV. And one of them was a prostitution law. And we were very, very clear as a coalition. We came together first as a coalition of people living with HIV, and then we wanted to address these laws. And then we thought, who else needs to be at the table with us? And we realized that we needed to make sure that people, that we had sex workers at the table. And so we went out as we were building our coalition and intentionally included everyone in that work. And it was critical because we were able to really think about how people wanted to show up. And again, it goes back to almost my comment about allowing people to be in leadership roles without having to disclose. It goes to having them be engaged, dog meltdown now, of course, having them be engaged without having to disclose that they're sex workers either. And we were able to significantly impact our law and remove it in Colorado because we had that connection and because we had those people who were part of our organizing. They didn't want to be a part of any of the public facing conversations about HIV criminalization and sex work, but we were able to use what they had told us as we were writing the laws and the legislation that removed it. And so in many ways, I think that coalition work can be really intentional when we think about, again, who needs to be at the table, how are they comfortable being at the table, and how do we make sure that we really are in partnership with it.
Thank you for that, Barb, and thank you for all of the amazing questions that we've gotten. I want to be conscious of people's time, but also flag that our H&P advocates, please stay on after the end of this call. And also, I just want to flag as well, our November webinar is happening on the 14th, and it's going to be on legislative sessions, and it'll be at 6 p.m. EST the same time. Thank you so much, Kamaria and Barb. Those were amazing presentations. And yes, like we said, our advocates, please stay on. But thank you.
Are y'all still